but Psalm 37 is one of my favorites. This is a psalm that David wrote in his old age. We know that from context. We didn't read it this morning, but in verse 25, David references his old age. So he's got two things on his side to start with. The first is wisdom, and the second is experience. That's part of why this psalm reads almost more like the book of Proverbs than like the rest of the Psalms of David. He's not burning with fiery passion. He's still very emotional. But he really wants to get the point across. And so he takes the time to put everything on the page. Because once we have that wisdom and experience on our side, it changes things. I've learned that in my short time on this earth. There are things I did 10 years ago that today, if I were to even think about it, I would cringe. Like my personal favorite, we'll do a youth trip this next weekend. Woo! What was I thinking? I've asked myself that question many times. And that's probably why when I was interviewed at a church several years ago, there were a couple funny questions throughout, but then I get to the end, and the gentleman says, "Now, Matt, I'm going to ask you the toughest question you're going to hear tonight." And I'm like, oh, great. This is going to be some theological bombshell that I'm going to have to try and diffuse. And he says, "Now, you're applying to work with a bunch of 6th and 7th graders like my kids. Are you crazy or is there something wrong with you?" And you know, you're on the phone. You can't see their face or hear the laughter in that look. My first comment was, "Excuse me?" And he said, "Well, you're applying to work with a bunch of junior high kids every week, multiple times a week. Are you crazy or is there something wrong with you?" At which point I could clearly answer, both and. Because I didn't yet have that wisdom and experience on my side. I still don't. I have a lot more than I used to. But as we read this psalm, take it from that. David is sharing what he's gained from age. That if we don't have that, we won't know. We can't know the things where we have misstepped, the places that we could have done better, and the things that we really wish we had to do over again. And so he shares some of that, but it all boils down to a big question. Because he is asking something we have all struggled with. His line is, why do the wicked prosper? Or to put it in terms that we think of, why would God allow that to happen? Pick whatever event it is. Why would God let that happen? Or maybe, why does God let bad things happen to good people? This is what he's struggling with. And it's a question that people have used to discredit God, Christianity, and the church for ages. It's nothing new. David was dealing with it. How do we explain all these things that happen? His primary thing is, it looks like the evil, the wicked are winning. He starts there in verse 1. And he says, "Don't worry about the wicked or envy those who do wrong. For like grass, they soon fade away, and like spring flowers, they soon wither." That's where he starts. He says, it looks like they're winning. It looks like the good is not going to triumph. And this is David in his old age. He's gone through the struggles. He had his own son try to overthrow him. He has dealt with Saul chasing him through caves after God said, "You're going to be my king." And here his king is running away from the one who was chosen, who's trying to kill him. He's been there. He's been through the ringer. He has all that experience, and he's still asking the question. And we see it day in, day out. I mean, right now it seems like there is a ton of stuff going on. You turn on the news, and there's the next riot or the next issue going on in a city somewhere in our country. I mean, over July 4th weekend in Chicago, they had 86 people gunned down in the streets. That's not just, it's not right. We see all these issues where race is brought up, where things are exploding in places, and it's not right. We see people who die before their time. We see cancer. We see all of these issues that make us ask, why? And that's what David tries to answer. But for some of us, maybe it's more personal. It's that coworker or neighbor who you know they cheat on their taxes. Maybe they cheat on their spouse. They don't do things the right way. But their garage is full of nice cars. It's a new house. They've got great furniture. Everything looks great. They took a 2-week vacation to Malawi. And you contrast that with your own life. You're doing the right things, and you've got that clunker that just hit 200,000 miles, and you're hoping you can coax some more out of it. You've got furniture Goodwill wouldn't even take. And you had a weekend at the Grand Canyon. That was the best you could manage for vacation, and you're working your hardest. It's very easy to see why David goes from don't worry about the wicked to don't envy what seems like their success. Because when we look at it, we're going to want that. I mean, it's easy to look at that person who it seems like they have it all together and want what they have, but want it for the wrong reasons. That's why David starts with don't worry and flows right into don't envy. Because if our focus is on what other people have and what they're doing, it quickly turns into envy, no matter how well-intentioned it might start. Because we want to worry about what they're getting that we're not, about how they're getting it and we're not. And if we look at it and we compare those toys, you know the saying, he who dies with the most toys wins? There are people who live that way, and we look at them and we want what they have because they have stuff. But David says there's more to it. He says things may not always look fair, but that God is in control. In fact, even outside of Scripture, philosophers and others have talked to it. Aristotle had this term, nemesis. And in Greek, he said it meant pain at undeserved good fortune. Righteous indignation arising from a sense of the claims of justice and desert, which is aroused in us by the contemplation of success without merit, and a consequent pleasure in the punishment of one who is thus undeservedly prosperous. You've got a Greek philosopher. He sees the injustice in the world and comments on it. It's not just us. It's not just David. We see these things, and we desire fair. But as I've told my kids, life isn't fair. And the only reason I know that is because my parents told me. And then I got to live it, and I realized life isn't fair. And we scream at the injustice of the whole thing. But I think Calvin hits the nail on the head. This is what he says. The more boldly any man despises God and runs to every excess in wickedness, so much more the happily they seem to live. And since prosperity appears to be a token of God's favor towards the ungodly, what conclusion, it may be said, can be drawn from this? But either that the world is governed by chance and that fortune bears the sovereignty, or else that God makes no difference between the good and the bad. That's his question. If we say that it's just chance, where's God? If we say that, well, it just happens. Or even if we say that, yeah, it's God's favor resting on them, that's why they have stuff, we're still missing the point. We're missing the point that running after something temporary doesn't address the eternal issues of our heart. Because God designed us for more. And that's why David goes from don't worry about the wicked, don't envy their stuff, straight into the reference about the grass. In Kansas, we know all about how grass withers and fades. This summer's an exception. But on a normal basis, if you miss a week of water in your yard, it's going to go from green and nice to yellow and crispy where it crunches down into a dust when you walk. That is what grass is, and that's what David is referencing. And as we talked about in Psalm 23, God leads us to green pastures. David knows intimately about the importance of grass and how quickly it disappears. Because he would lead his sheep somewhere. They would eat. They would graze. Everything was good. But then the sun comes out and they're gone. So he uses that to parallel what happens when we see those who do wrong winning. Because there is no breadth to their experience. It is temporary. It is light and momentary. And yet we get so caught up in that. So David offers a prescription in verse 3. Trust in the Lord. So trust in God, he says. But not just that. Trust in the Lord and do good. Because if we believe in the reliability, truth, and strength of our God, we see injustice, And when the wicked seem to triumph, our answer is to change our vision. We see this win. We see this evil in our world. But if our trust is in God, we know that He has an end game. He has a solution. It's just like chess. You move the pieces around the board, trying to convince your opponent to do something. God already knows the moves on the board. Checkmate is assured. It's going to happen because there's an empty tomb. The question is, how do we get there? He says, trust and do good. Now, when I'm angry or when I'm upset, I've found that the best way to focus myself is to work. I don't know if any of you have the same nature, but if I'm upset and angry, I'll go do the dishes. I'll mop a floor. I will find something to occupy myself physically. Why? Because then I process. I think about it, and I move from angry to responsive. I move from reacting out of something that I don't want to towards the way that God wired me to go. Because my trust has to be paired with action. If I just trust that God's going to do something and sit by, I'm not doing my part. That's why he says trust in the Lord and do good. We know God is going to win, but that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility. When we see things that don't work in this world, we are reminded to do something about it. Because he says, trust in the Lord and do good, then you will safely live in the land and prosper. He brings in that reference to the promised land. David and his listeners knew exactly what he meant when he said they were going to live safely in the land. They fought tooth and nail to get the promised land that God had told Abraham years prior would be his. It was a promise. It was a covenant that God had made, and it was going to happen. But the two things David says have to happen: trust in the Lord and do good then. That word is there on purpose. It's a clause built together. If we just sit on our haunches and hope, we've got one part down. But he says do good. Go do something with your anger and your indignation at seeing the wicked prosper. He says, go and do something. Because Abraham was promised he would become a great nation, and from him God would change the world. We know that God did. He sent his only son. He gave the Israelites a land to live in, carved it out of their enemies, and it was flowing with milk and honey. The very word, the promised land, resonates with who God is and who his faithfulness and how his faithfulness plays out. That's why David uses the phrase. To quote Calvin again, Calvin says, dwell in the land. It's a promise that you may enjoy it in sure and lasting repose. He's saying, God promised us a place. It might not be now, but God's faithful to his promise. He is worthy of our trust. Are we willing to trust him, do good, and go where he leads? All of that's wrapped up into that little bit in verse 3. And then David hits verse 4, which many people have taken out of context, and you can use to justify a lot of things. But it says, take delight in the Lord. I love the word delight because it's taking great pleasure, being intoxicated with our God. It's just like dating someone. It starts with infatuation, but it moves on. And in Hebrew, there are 3 different words for love that our students that were there Wednesday know these. But there are 3 Hebrew words for love. There's raya. Yeah, Michael, do you remember any of those? Adam's checking. No. But it starts with raya. That's a friendship kind of love. But then there's the same love that in Greek we would translate agape. And it's ahava. Ahava is a deep, abiding, committed kind of love. It's love that never lets go, love that never fails, love that never ends. It's the kind of love that God has for us. When we read the words, God loves you, our English is so limiting. We lose the flavor there. But when you talk about loving someone, there's a big difference between saying, I love you, and I love Taco Bell. We hope that the two aren't uttered close to each other. Because we all know that we mean different things. When I tell my wife I love her, I hope that I mean something far different than I love tacos slathered in grease. I mean, we hope that that's the thing. And when we talk about delight, it's that kind of love that doesn't let go. It's the passionate pursuit of something. This is when John Piper paraphrases the Westminster Catechism, and he says that God is most glorified in you when you are most satisfied in Him. Let me read that again. God is most glorified in you when you are most satisfied in Him. That is delight. It's contentment that goes beyond what we think we have. It's totally committed to that goal. It is seeking after it with all of our hearts. Jesus said, seek first the kingdom. He didn't say seek first money. He didn't say seek first comfort. Seek first the kingdom, and then all these things will be added unto you. That's taking this psalm where it goes. Take delight in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. If you are delighting in God and He is your passionate pursuit, He is the one you were chasing after, your heart's desires have changed. Because trust and action is one thing. Choosing to change our focus from worrying about what these people are doing to what God is doing, that changes our minds. But when we delight in the Lord and we take the time to sit in His presence, it changes our hearts. It changes who we are. Because all of a sudden, our minds, our focus, and our hearts are placed solely on God. And when we are chasing Him that passionately, He becomes everything to us. And then as our hearts desire what He wants, that is what God does. Delight in the Lord. Passionately seek Him, and He will give you the desires of your heart. I mean, honestly, think about that for a minute. He will give you the desires of your heart. Can I honestly say that I am passionately pursuing God enough that my desires line up to His? I don't think so very often. If I'm honest, my desires are still selfish. My desires are still mine. But God's promise here is that if we delight in Him, that He will give us the desires of our heart. And that comes when our passion and delight is wrapped up in one thing. We do everything for it. It's like in the dating game. You're buying flowers. You're buying chocolate. You're dressing up. You're doing everything you possibly can to make a good impression because you are delighting in that other person. You are chasing after their love and affection by doing things. And you continue doing so. That's the way it progresses. That is the kind of relationship God is encouraging us to have with Him. If we delight in Him, are we putting the same degree of effort and intensity into His pursuit that we have in a temporary relationship on this earth? It changes us. It changes us when He is our delight. And that leads into the next verse. David follows logically. He says, after take delight in the Lord, and He'll give you the desires of your heart. He says, commit everything you do. Everything. Not some things. Not a couple things. Commit everything you do to the Lord. Trust Him. He'll help you. It puts the onus back on God. He says, if you commit everything you do to God, if you are putting all your cards on the table in His service and in His passionate pursuit, He will help you. It's not a question. It's a promise. He will. And here's the kicker. The timing may not be the way we want, but the logical progression, it follows. If we're not worrying about other people, but putting our focus solely on God, if we are trusting in Him and doing good, doing what He put us here for, and we're taking our delight in Him, it makes it a whole lot easier to commit our everything to His service. Missionaries through the years have given their very lives to go and make disciples. I really struggled with stories to pull because there's so many. from William Borden, who gave up a family fortune, his whole family and everything, to not even make it to the country he thought he was called to go to. And instead left us the words, no retreat, no regrets. On his deathbed. He didn't even make it to China. And you've got so many others. But I found myself drawn to a story in Daniel that we all know. You've heard it in Sunday school many times. It's the story of the fiery furnace. But there's some of it that I think we miss. We sanitize the stories in Sunday school, and we miss the power contained therein. Now listen to this. This is from Daniel. And this is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're standing before the king who's erected a giant golden idol and said, bow down or you're going to die. And these three men have refused time and again to bow. And they're all of a sudden in front of the king. He's told them what is going to happen. And he says, you must bow to the idol or I am going to kill you. And this is what these three men say. O Nebuchadnezzar king, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But, even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you that we will never serve your gods or worship the golden statue you have set up. We will burn. Rather than change our course, change our loyalties, because we know the God we serve. That's what they said. Their lives are worth nothing at all compared to the all-surpassing glory that is the God we serve. They say that even if our God doesn't save us, because he's able, we know it. And they're standing before the most powerful man in their world. They stare him down. They're like, our God can save us. We don't care what you do. Because he can save us and he is able. But even if he doesn't, that line is huge. Even if our God doesn't save us at this moment, we know where it ends. Our God is just. Our God is true. He is trustworthy and faithful. And he will not let us down. We know in whom we have believed in. And he is able. Maybe not in this instant. But we're going to let you know exactly where we stand. This is our line in the sand. We will go no farther. You will not cross this land. It's that moment at the Alamo. Are you going to stand? Or are you going to surrender? That's where these three men were faced with. They had a tough choice. Everything in their world had changed. They'd been ripped out of their land and taken to a foreign country. They were forced to serve the country. They served the king. And they did so to the best of their abilities. To the fact where they moved up into higher ranks of leadership. And then this happens. They had been able to stay true to their God. Earlier in Daniel, you hear about them saying, we're not going to eat the food from your table sacrificed to idols. We're going to eat vegetables and water and be true to our God. They stuck to their guns there. Now they're missing their friend Daniel. And they're in front of the entire court in that part of the world. And they still hold true to their God. Because they were committed to who he was and what he had done for them, no matter what. No matter when. No matter where. They knew that everything depended upon their God. And they knew that he absolutely was capable. As we fight the battles in our life, as we see evil triumph and win, as we face that injustice, we have two choices. We can choose to become conscious of what they're doing, or we can choose to be a part of what God is doing instead. Spurgeon said this, when we're conscious that we have been more righteous than someone, the devil is sure to be at hand with blasphemous reasonings. When we see something, be assured the enemy will take advantage of that moment. I mean, I guarantee you, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had moments where they wondered, what in the heck are we doing? Or are we really going to say this to the king? It'd be so much easier to say, that's all right, we'll just go with it. But instead, they stood up And they said, no matter what, our God is who we serve. But those blasphemous reasonings that chase us, we want to figure out a way to minimize our discomfort. We look for that option. It's humanity. It's who we are. It's how we were wired. We fight for ourselves. But our part is never to demand God's action. Our part is to be still in obedience to him and wait for him to act. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not try to escape the furnace that day. They were more than willing to go. In fact, the text later tells us the two men who were trying to haul them to the furnace, they died. And these three men live through it because of their God. An entire nation saw it. The king issues a declaration that there's only one God. It's the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That is the end game that came from their faithfulness. Even if God didn't save them, they were going to stand on that promise, knowing that he would win the day. It might not be their lives their way, but God would win the day. And that is what comforts David, is that our God is trustworthy and true. His plans and purposes always succeed, even when we think they're failing. The disciples went through that moment. Jesus is dead. Everything's lost. They're done. They're scattered. They're running away. They are scared stiff because they forgot that God has the end game in mind. It might not be right now. It might not be what we want, but his plans always prevail. And that's where David ends in this psalm. He says, be still in the presence of God and wait patiently for him to act. Our job is not to demand God to bow to our whims. Our job is not to tell God what he needs to do. If we are trusting him, delighting in him, and committed to his plans and his purposes, then we have to trust that even if it seems like we're losing, that God is faithful, that God is true, and that he will prevail. 2 Corinthians talks about our light and momentary affliction. When we're going through things, it doesn't seem light. It doesn't seem momentary. In fact, it hurts. We fight. We don't want to be there. I have never wanted to go through the painful things in life. But John Piper said it best, that light and momentary affliction, you cannot see what it is doing. You can't understand the work that is going on inside of you through it. But it is. The work is happening inside of you, and God is reshaping you with a weight of glory. And that is what happens through our trials. When we see the evil winning, when we see injustice, we get angry. We react to it. Psalm 37 tells us, don't worry about what they're doing. Trust God. Do good. Do what you're built for right here, right now. Delight in him. Passionately chase God with all that you are. And commit your everything to him. Then he follows it up. Be still in the presence of the Lord. Be still. In our society, it is so hard to find a moment's rest. My question is this: when is the last time you were still in the presence of God? And in this case, in the Hebrew, silence is part of what he means. When is the last time you were still in the presence of God? When we weren't talking to him, but we were just there, basking in the presence of God and nothing else. If you're like me, it's been a while, because there are so many things we have to do. There's so many other things vying for our time and our attention that we miss the moments that matter most. We may have gone through every single other step in David's progression. What happens if we're not still? If we don't rest in what God is doing? I'm convinced that if we miss those moments, we miss the chances to be a part of what God is doing, fighting in our own power. There's a reminder in my office that it's all about God and not about me. It's just some simple phrases. Because I'm a youth pastor, I've seen a lot of kids walk through my doors. Some that I'm like, can I adopt you? Can you be my child? We'll take you. Others that I'm like, oh, sweet Lord, make something happen. And before Facebook and Twitter and all the social media, it was easy for me to live with my head in the sand, thinking that I was making a huge impact. Because I didn't see hey, we got back from mission trip. I went out and got, blah, blah, blah at a party last night. I'm going, oh, great. Glad to see I made a nice impact on your life. But I have to remind myself it's not about me, no matter how much I think it is. And this simple poem from another youth worker summarizes it. I am limited, but he is limitless. I may have vision, but he has to be my vision. I have a point of view. He has the view. I plan, but he has a better one. I am proud, but he graces me with humility. I am led, but his Holy Spirit guides me. I am weak, but he is my strength. I speak loudly and with passion. I resonate with that one. But his voice thunders. I fall, he picks me up. I have a purpose, but he is behind it. I grow weary, he never sleeps. I am driven, but he is my rest. I run dry, he is my source. I tend to crack. He is my strong foundation. I may sing, but he is my melody. And I know the Word. He is the Word made flesh. When I think it's all about me, that's where I turn back to. Because it's not about me. It is about what God is doing in, through, and for me. The question is, am I willing to trust him enough to commit my everything, even in spite of what the world is doing? And that's the question we are faced with today. Are you willing to commit your everything? Your wallets, your families, your vocation, everything to God. To follow where he leads, knowing that, he has the end game in mind. But being willing to burn even if he doesn't save us from this? That's the question we have. Is our God trustworthy? Are we willing to trust that he is who he says he is? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood up for it. And God was faithful to them, and he delivered them from the furnace. But that declaration resonates with me. O King, even if our God doesn't save us, we will burn before we serve your gods and deviate from who he is and what he has done in our lives. This light and momentary affliction is working out in us an eternal weight of glory. And while we might not see it, while some might think God has deserted us, he's not. He is trustworthy, and he will never fail us. In the last couple months, there's been a song that has resonated in my heart, written from a church in North Carolina. I don't know, it's one of the Carolinas. But their worship team wrote a song called Your Promises. And the chorus goes like this. I want you to hear this. It goes, it doesn't matter what I feel. It doesn't matter what I see. My hope will always be your promises to me. Now I'm casting out all fear because your love has set me free. My hope will always be your promises to me because you will always be more than enough. Nothing is going to stop the plans you've made, and nothing's going to take your love away. You will always be more than enough for me. And my hope will always be your promises to me. Our God is trustworthy and true. His plans and purposes always succeed, even when we think they're not. Even when we're faced with that moment. But God is in control. And if we fail to believe that God is in control of this world, he's set in motion, that he calls every star out by name every night. If our God is not in control of all of this, then what kind of God do we serve? I'll tell you, it's not a God. It is a thing that we've put in his place. Because our God is faithful. He's true. He's powerful. He made this world and everything in it, and he always brings his plans to fruition. Our job is to commit our everything to him, to place our trust firmly in what he is doing, and know that even if we're called upon in that moment to burn, he is still God. He is still in control, and he will never, ever, ever fail. Because if God failed, the world would stop spinning. We would have no hope. But we are people of hope because we serve a risen Savior. The grave couldn't hold him and death couldn't keep him down. Because of his love, we draw breath today. So my question to you is this: who do you trust? Who do you believe in? And how far are you willing to go in that belief? Because I serve a trustworthy God who will never let me down. He will never run out. And he never, ever stops.